Today we'll be talking about Native American awareness and equity. My name is Alberto Alarcon, and I am the 3A Vice President. Today I'm joined by Felicity Brown, Laisha Diaz, and Deanna Redee. So Deanna, would you please tell us kind of what led you to be on this path and where you're at today?
Thank you for having me here today. I would like to start off with giving a land acknowledgement. I wish to acknowledge and honor the traditional territory of the indigenous communities in the Nevada region and recognize that Washoe, Northern Paiute, Southern Paiute, and Western Shoshone. I offer my gratitude for the land itself, for those who have stewarded this land throughout the generations, and for the opportunity to be a part of the community with this land. I thank them for their strength and resilience in protecting this land and aspire to uphold our responsibilities according to the example. I encourage everyone in this space to engage in continued learning about the Indigenous community who work and live on this land long before colonization, and about the historical and present realities of colonialism. Colonialism is a current ongoing process, and we need to build our mindfulness of our present participation. We are full of diverse communities, and I believe it is important to recognize and appreciate the use of the native land as part of its mission to be a welcoming and inclusive place for working and learning. Thank you. For those who don't know, my name again is Deanna Redee. I am an alum from Canyon Springs High School, Leadership and Law Preparatory Academy. I was a political leadership major, and I served all 4 years on the student council. My senior year, I was the senior class secretary. I was born and raised in Las Vegas. I went to college in Indiana at DePaul University, where I received my bachelor's in political science and anthropology. After I graduated from my undergrad, I moved to Superior, Wisconsin, and I was introduced into the world of advocacy. I started out in advocacy in 2017, and then I am now a legal advocate at Dabanuigan Domestic Violence Shelter in Duluth, Minnesota, where I serve the predominantly Native community, victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking.
So Deanna, you had first of all, thank you for sharing with us your path. And I know you mentioned the land acknowledgement and you introduced that in the beginning. I was kind of wondering, what are some things that we as non-Native Americans can do to acknowledge the fact that we are on Native land, like it or not? And what are some things that we can do to support the Native community, especially that this month, seeing that it is Native American Heritage Month, but not only this month, but year round?
So I think it's super important. So I am by no means an expert. I am still learning and growing myself as an individual, as an advocate, learn from amazing elders throughout my community. I work, the land that I'm on is Anishinaabe. I work mostly with the Ojibwe community. And I think that by saying that, so notice how in the land acknowledgement, it's different land that from what I put in the land acknowledgement compared to the land that I am currently on right now. And oftentimes I think there's just a big generalization of the Native community where every Native is the same, but that's not the case. There are, different bands, different tribes, different beliefs within their tribes. And so I think that's like a very big step, is acknowledging that the land is not the same the land varies and geographically. And that, so it is important for us as individuals and, it is important for us to learn and educate ourselves, and look at what land are we on. I myself am not an enrolled member. I don't have enough blood quantum. However, on my dad's side, there was Cherokee and Choctaw, but my dad was not enrolled, so I myself cannot be enrolled. And which is really unfortunate, because then that is a part of my own identity that I feel like I don't have. And so I think it's really important to when we're talking about what we see a lot of today is appropriation, of taking the Native identity and making it their own. So we see in mascots that are used by schools. The hot topic a lot is costumes and dressing in the Pocahontas costume that is often the most popular one that is to be seen. And it's recognizing that that's not for non-natives to use because it is sacred. So we're by taking something that is not for a non-native person to take that is sacred is offending, and it's hurtful, and it leaves a big impact because it almost makes it seem as if we're not important or we're less than. And I think that it's a great thing to have this conversation here today and talking about how we can do better and to create to preserve the Native identity and to not take it as one own.
And a quick question that popped into my head right now. You mentioned blood quantum, and I know I have heard about that, but some of our listeners may not have heard about that or may want to go get a better explanation. Would you be willing to explain that for us here?
Yeah, certainly. So when I say blood quantum, I'm not so glad I mentioned that. It's not to be confused with popular DNA test kits like 23andMe, where that is in and of itself, where I have also seen cultural appropriation, where someone I actually know several people who took the test and would be like, I'm 0.10% or 0.10 Native American. And I'm like, really, I don't think that's how it works, but okay. So, but when I talk about blood quantum, each tribe has like for enrollment, some tribes require like a certain do require a certain percentage in order to be enrolled. I know here there are several tribes here where it's if you have a grandparent who's enrolled, but your parent might not be enrolled, you may be eligible for enrollment. So it really depends on the tribe, because there are tribes who don't rely on blood quantum for enrollment because of we as we see today, there's this the famous term like the melting pot, where there's so much diversity and so much interracial marriages or interracial partners and relationships. So it's not necessarily these relationships and are not necessarily all within the same race. So to answer, or to the long story short of it, is that depending on the tribe, some tribes may require a certain percentage for blood of your blood to be Native in order to be enrolled, but that varies from tribe to tribe.
Well, hello, my name is Laisha Diaz. I am a senior currently attending Eldorado High School in the senior minor area, but I'm also the student body vice president at Eldorado. Nice to meet you. Something that was mentioned when it comes to land, as Alberto was saying, people, if we look back into history, we can see a lot of trauma that was caused by colonizers and that the Native Americans had to move away from their native land. But my question is, do we see this trauma that was created like a long time ago? Do we still see that trauma in the present day? Like, is it even a possibility?
The trauma is very real, and it's still present in today's generation. One of the many teachings that I learned is about the 7 generations. And within that teaching, I learned that it takes at least 7 generations for the trauma, for someone to be healed from that trauma. Because from what I've learned is that trauma is intergenerational. It is passed on from our ancestors. So when natives were pushed out of their home, their land, and then to and then as they with their future generations, their future relatives, that trauma got passed on to them. And even so, a lot of a lot of when we talk about the taking of the land, people just assume that, oh, like Christopher Columbus when he invaded and stole the land. But what a lot of people don't know about, unfortunately, and even myself, I didn't learn about until after I got involved in advocacy, was boarding schools. And boarding schools happened in the 60s and the 70s, and what led to what and a result of that, the Indian Child Welfare Act, because when the boarding schools were happening, Native children were forced out of their homes and placed into the boarding schools and forced assimilation by white people, by colonizers. And in those boarding schools, it wasn't just forcing assimilation and forcing to forget all that their own cultural history. They were told that history was wrong. They were told that being Native is not good, and that it's not, and that their religion was wrong, that their culture was wrong, and if those who didn't abide by that assimilation were often abused physically, sexually, or even killed. And that was just the 60s and 70s. That's not long ago at all. So there are elders I've worked with who are survivors of boarding schools, and that trauma very much lives with them. And depending on who you talk to, there are survivors who don't want to mention it at all, who have not fully healed. And then there are some who do share their story, but even then you can still see the hurt and the pain. And that trauma did get passed along to their children and their children's children.
Oh, okay. Well, saying that back to the whole topic of land, land plays I can see that plays a huge aspect just in the Native culture. But seeing that when colonizers came through, the natives were pushed out of the land, correct? But they were pushed into like these rural areas where there's already a limited source of resources. How do these limited resources impact the Native American community?
The lack of access, major impact. There's now what we're all trying to survive through is with COVID-19. In the media, you see a lot with the Navajo Nation and their struggles and not having access to testing kits or the funding to protective wear. That not having that, the also known as PPE, not having access to that. And then you see a higher amount of deaths in the communities, and there's just a big disproportionate rate among the and not just Indigenous, but for a lot of people of color, but predominantly a lot in the in Native communities. Even in our Minnesota area, there are tribal lands that are in rural areas, and they're still working to get testing kits brought out to their area, because if a lot of times in the rural areas, they may not have transportation to get to urban areas where all the testing kits are, or where like all the larger hospitals are for ICUs and access to like the ventilators. So, and that's not me saying that all rural tribal areas are struggling, but you do see a higher, like I said, a higher disproportionate throughout the Native community where there is just lack of access. And another thing on top of that is, so when I mentioned the boarding schools, there's a lot of distrust in the system. And so asking, to put a lot of faith can be difficult, especially when it's government entities or systems are who are in control of these tests. And it sometimes may feel like more of another power and control move. And so it becomes hard, in addition to not having access, but also having to rely on the system in order to get better.
All right, thank you. And just another thing, saying that, again, like you brought up COVID. COVID is all around us now. It changed our lives in predominantly negative way for anyone. But how do you think people can be aware of what's going on with the Native community? Because even though the media does bring it up time to time, it doesn't bring it up the whole story. How do you think people can be aware of what's happening when it comes to the Native community during these hard times?
It is really hard, because I wish I could say in a non-COVID world, it would be to go out and educate and learn who are the individuals of the land that we're on, and speaking with elders and, offering tobacco and having that conversation. I'm really fortunate that I am around, when I work throughout the community, that I can learn, and I immerse myself into it. But that the great thing about like how we're talking today on Zoom, there's so many opportunities to learn about. So even not just like with COVID, but like how we're talking about the land was taken and still being taken. We seeing like with the pipelining and not having access to water, and because while it's true to not generalize the Native community, but it's also important to know that there is that land and is sacred, water is sacred. And so when we're seeing that land be disturbed for pipelining, it's pretty much like another traumatic experience all over again, because it's like seeing your land taken all over again, especially when that pipelining does go into tribal land, and it becomes a debate all over again, whose land is who. But in reality, the land belongs to the Native community. It's indigenous land.
All right, well, thank you so much for answering my questions.
Hi, I'm Felicity Brown. I go to Sandy Valley High School. I'm a senior. I'm also vice president of Division 1A. I'm on the NASC board. Something that I wanted to ask you was, what do you think are some steps that we could take to kind of break down the stereotypes and the cultural appropriation that's happening today?
Language is the key thing. If there's anything that anyone were to take away from listening to this talk, is how the language we use. I can say I was most likely guilty of doing this, but the popular one that we hear is spirit animal. You see it on BuzzFeed quizzes. What's your spirit animal? Well, that could be a step. Acknowledging that spirit animals aren't ours. That's a traditional value to the Native community, and by making that our own, it's also offensive. And then we also see it, the hot button topic, mascots, where not only we see it like in professional sports, but we also see it within our schools. And I think as leaders, it's important to have those conversations, because how can we create a true inclusive, safe environment if there is if a certain cultural identity is being singled out and exploited? And it's great to have student leaders, because as leaders, we can start having those conversations, and they are difficult conversations, but they're much needed. And the more that people talk about it, it can lead to more people to listen. And that's not to say there won't be pushback, but I mean, look at where we're at now. There are teams that aren't, like, I believe the Redskins, who don't have a mascot, and that's because people became louder, and that sometimes that being loud is necessary. I mean, I naturally can say I'm a loud person, but that's okay, because I mean, I do what I do. But using terms also like savage, calling people savage, that's another very derogatory term, because how are we to use a term that can also be used jokingly, but yet that was used as a term to degrade Native Americans. Not long ago, it was the Native community were told that they weren't good enough, or that they had to, if they had really dark skin, they had to lighten down their skin, because that is what was considered beautiful. And those who didn't assimilate were called savages, when that's not the case, because long before colonization, they're beautiful and well enriched culture. And that's the last thing from savage. And then also another one that I do hear a lot is, let's go have a powwow. That's another traditional sacred ceremony. So why not just say, let's go have a meeting? So like just seeing that, like how easy it is with language, there are words that are better that can be used. And I think that is like one of the big steps. And then also just taking the time to go out and learn. I mean, a lot of, like I said, we're in COVID-19. What better opportunity to learn now if a lot of people do have to be home in quarantine, you know? Learn and educate ourselves, because there's a lot of people don't know about the, for example, missing and murdered Indigenous women movement, where Native women are at a higher rate of being from being taken and then being killed, and often are labeled as runaways. And the thing is, I wish I could give you data as to what those numbers are, but because it wasn't considered important or a priority or prevalent, that there isn't accurate data as to how many Native women have gone missing, as to how many Native women have been murdered. There are steps that are being taken nationally, our states are creating a task force and acknowledging that it's a invisible epidemic that's happening, that's not being talked about enough. So I think not just using this month, but using every day to learn. I think that is a really big, important takeaway, because every day is Indigenous Peoples Day, every day. I know just recently, so there are cities who don't also recognize Columbus Day. Instead, it's rather Indigenous Peoples Day. So that is another conversation that can be had amongst student leaders. It's not recognizing Columbus Day because Columbus didn't do anything great for the Native community. Rather than it's recognizing that it's Indigenous Peoples Day.
I think that's all that we have for you today. So thank you so much for joining us and talking to us about this. It's a very important conversation that we need to begin. And it's important that we do our research and we, dig more into the land that we're on, and how to acknowledge these beautiful cultures. So I hope that everyone who is watching this just keeps in mind that it is every day is Indigenous Peoples Day, and that you should start those important conversations. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.